The morning begins before the light. There is a soft gray color resting over the rooftops, not quite night, not yet day. The air feels cool and still, as if the world is holding its breath for just a little while longer. Inside a small brick house, a child slowly opens their eyes. There is no gentle wake up. No quiet stretching into the day. Instead, there is already movement. A faint sound of footsteps on the wooden floor. The low crackle of a fire being brought back to life. The quiet clink of metal as a pot is set into place. Someone else has already been awake for some time. The child does not stay in bed. There is no habit of lingering. They sit up, slowly at first, then more quickly, as if remembering something important. The room is shared, and space is limited. Beds are close together, and the air carries the soft warmth of many people sleeping in one place. The blanket is folded back. The floor is cold beneath their feet. For a moment, everything feels still. Then the day begins. Clothing is pulled on without much thought. The fabric is rough in places, worn from many uses. It does not fit perfectly, but it is enough. It keeps out the chill, and that is what matters. Buttons are fastened. Shoes are found. There is little time to adjust or complain. The child moves quietly, careful not to be slow. Because even at this early hour, there is already something expected of them. In the next room, a parent works steadily. There is no rush in their movements, but there is no pause either. Each action follows the next in a calm and practiced rhythm. Water is poured. Bread is prepared. The fire is tended. The child joins in without needing to be told. A small task is given. Maybe it is carrying something across the room. Maybe it is holding a tool. Maybe it is simply standing nearby, ready to help. These tasks are simple. But they are important. And they are part of the day. Outside, the street is beginning to wake. The first sounds are soft. A cart rolling slowly over stone. The distant step of a horse. A door opening somewhere down the road. There is no loud beginning to the day. Only a quiet gathering of movement. The child steps outside for a moment. The air feels different here. Cooler, fresher, but also heavier in a way that is hard to explain. The buildings stand close together, their windows dark or just beginning to glow with candlelight. There are other children too. Some walking quickly. Some carrying small bundles. Some already working beside adults. No one is playing. No one is wandering. Everyone seems to be moving towards something. The child watches for only a second. Then turns back inside. Because there is still more to do. Breakfast, if it comes, is simple. A small piece of bread. Maybe something warm. There is no long sitting at the table. No slow conversation. Food is eaten quietly, sometimes quickly, as if it is just another task to complete before the next one begins. And then, without ceremony, the day moves forward. For some children, this means walking to school. For others, it means stepping directly into work. The difference depends on the home, the family, the small details of life that shape each day. But the feeling remains the same. There is always a direction. Always a purpose. And very little space in between. The child walks along the street. The ground is uneven beneath their feet. The buildings stretch upward, casting long shadows that shift slowly as the light begins to grow. There is a rhythm to the walking. Step after step. No stopping. No turning away. Just moving forward. Sometimes, another child walks beside them. But there is little talking. Words are saved. Energy is kept. Because the day ahead is long. And it has already begun. By the time the sun has fully risen, the child is already deep inside the day. There is no feeling of beginning anymore. Only continuation. The tasks that seemed small in the early morning now begin to gather, one after another, forming a steady line that stretches quietly into the afternoon. Nothing feels rushed. But nothing feels light either. Each responsibility, no matter how simple, carries a certain weight. A bucket filled with water is not just a bucket. It is something that must be carried carefully, without spilling, from one place to another. The handle presses into small fingers. The water moves gently inside, shifting with each step. The child walks slowly. Not because they want to take their time, but because they must. There is no room for carelessness. Nearby, an older figure works with practiced ease. Their movements are steady, almost effortless. They have done these things many times before. Their hands know what to do without thinking. The child watches, learns, repeats. This is how knowledge is passed. Not through long explanations, but through quiet observation and careful imitation. If something is done wrong, it is corrected. Sometimes with words, sometimes without. The correction is quick, and the expectation is clear. Do it again. Do it better. And so the child tries. Again and again. Until the movement feels natural. Until the task becomes part of them. There is no moment where someone says, "This is play." Because it is not. It is practice. It is preparation. It is life, beginning early. Even in homes where there is a little more comfort, the structure remains. Time is divided carefully. Morning lessons begin. Books are opened. Pages are turned slowly. The room is quiet except for the soft sound of reading. A teacher, or sometimes a parent, watches closely. There is an expectation of focus, of stillness, of attention. The child sits upright, hands placed neatly, eyes on the page. There is no drifting away, no daydreaming. If the mind wanders, it is gently, or sometimes firmly, brought back. Because learning is serious. It is not meant to be playful. It is meant to shape, to guide, to prepare the child for a future that has already been imagined for them. Outside, the world continues its steady motion. The sounds grow slightly louder now. More carts, more voices, more movement. But still, there is a certain calm beneath it all. A quiet order. Everything has its place. Everything moves in its own time. And the child remains within this rhythm. There is no sudden escape from it. No hidden corner where time stretches freely. Even moments that seem empty are soon filled. A small errand. A quick task. A reminder of something that still needs to be done. And so, the day continues. Not in leaps or bursts, but in steady, measured steps. Each one following the last. Each one leading quietly into the next. The hours pass without being counted. There is no need to look at a clock. The body begins to understand the rhythm on its own. The feeling of morning shifts into something softer. Something slower. But not freer. Never freer. And somewhere within this steady flow, something very small begins to settle. A quiet understanding that this is how days are meant to be. that this is what is expected, and that there is little space for anything else. By late morning, the world of the Victorian child settles into a steady rhythm that feels almost unchanging. The light outside grows a little brighter, but inside the schoolroom, it remains muted. Sunlight filters through tall, narrow windows, landing in thin strips across wooden desks. Dust sometimes floats in those beams, slow and quiet, moving without direction. The room itself feels arranged with intention. Everything has a place. Everything stays still. Rows of desks face forward, all aligned carefully, as if the room itself is asking for order. The wooden surfaces are worn smooth in places, marked by years of use. Ink stains remain in small dark spots, like memories that never fully faded. The children sit in silence. Not absolute silence, but a controlled one. A silence shaped by expectation. There is the faint sound of breathing. The soft turning of pages. A chair shifting slightly, then stopping again. The teacher stands at the front, holding presence more than voice. Their movements are measured. When they speak, it is clear and direct. No extra words. Nothing unnecessary. A lesson begins. It is not meant to feel like discovery. It is meant to feel like repetition. Letters are spoken. Numbers are written. Phrases are repeated until they settle firmly into memory. The child writes slowly at first. The hand is still learning control. The pen presses against the paper with a slight scratch, leaving marks that are sometimes uneven, sometimes too dark, sometimes too light. Mistakes are corrected. Quietly. Sometimes with a simple gesture. Sometimes with a firmer reminder. And then the writing continues. There is no rush, but there is also no pause for wandering thought. The mind is expected to stay within the boundaries of the lesson, as the body stays within the boundaries of the desk. Outside the window, life continues in a different rhythm. A horse passes slowly, its hooves steady against the street. A cart follows behind, carrying goods wrapped in cloth or wood. A distant voice calls out, though the words are not always clear. But inside the room, these sounds are far away. Almost unreal. As if they belong to another world that the children can see but not enter. The lesson continues for what feels like a long time, though time itself is not spoken of. There is no countdown. Only continuation. Only instruction. Only attention. When there is a brief pause, it is not a release. It is simply a shift. A new subject. A new page. A new set of instructions. The child remains seated. Back straight. Eyes forward. Hands ready. Even stillness becomes a kind of work. A kind of discipline. There are moments when the mind begins to drift, not far, but just enough to feel the softness of imagination trying to form. A thought of something distant. Something quiet. Something not tied to the room. But these moments are brief. They are pulled back quickly. By a voice. By a rule. By the simple structure of expectation. And so the mind returns. To the page. To the words. To the steady rhythm of learning. At midday, there is a break. It is not long. It does not feel like freedom. It feels more like a pause between tasks. Children stand, stretch slightly, move carefully through narrow spaces between desks. There is conversation, but it is soft. Controlled. Almost careful, as if even speech has limits. Some eat small meals. Bread. Simple food. Something carried from home. There is no loud laughter. No running. No spilling into open space. The room itself seems to encourage calmness even during rest. And soon, the break ends. The children return to their seats. The teacher calls them back without urgency. And the room settles again into its familiar stillness. Afternoon lessons begin. The light shifts slightly through the windows, changing the tone of the room. Shadows grow longer, softer. The air feels a little warmer, though still restrained. The writing continues. The reading continues. The repetition continues. Outside, the world is slowly moving toward evening, but inside, that change is barely felt. There is only the lesson. Only the structure. Only the steady shaping of attention. And within this structure, something quiet forms in the child's understanding. Not something spoken. Not something taught directly. But something absorbed slowly over time. That time is meant for purpose. That stillness is meant for control. And that play, though not forbidden in words, is not present in the shape of the day. It is not part of the rhythm. Not part of the structure. Not part of what is expected. And so it becomes something distant. Something that exists only in small gaps between responsibilities. If it exists at all. By the time the final lesson ends, the light outside has softened. The schoolroom grows quieter in a different way now. Not the silence of attention, but the silence of release. Desks are gathered. Books are closed. Movement returns, but slowly, as if the body itself is remembering how to move without instruction. Children leave in small groups, walking into the fading afternoon light. The street feels slightly different now. Less strict. Less confined. But still shaped by the same steady order that has guided the day. And as the child walks home, there is a feeling that the day is not truly ending. Only changing shape. The evening arrives gently, without ceremony. There is no clear moment when day becomes night. Instead, the light slowly softens, as if the world is easing itself downward into quiet. The streets feel calmer now, but not empty. People still move through them, though more slowly. Steps are less hurried. Voices are lower. The sense of urgency that filled the morning has faded, replaced by something steadier. The child walks home along familiar paths. The buildings look slightly different in this light. Shadows stretch longer across the stone. Windows begin to glow faintly as lamps are lit inside. Inside the home, the air is warm, though not soft. There is work still happening. There is always something still happening. A pot is placed over a fire. Cloth is folded. Tools are set aside. The rhythm of the day does not stop, it simply slows. The child steps inside. There is no dramatic greeting. Only acknowledgement. A quiet return to the space where the day began. Food is prepared. Simple, steady, familiar. It is eaten without rush, but also without pause. The body is tired in a way that has become normal, and so even rest feels structured. There is conversation sometimes. Short sentences. Practical words. Nothing that lingers too long. Outside, the sound of the street grows softer. A distant cart. A closing door. The faint wind moving between buildings. The world is settling. But not stopping. Inside the home, small tasks continue. Something is washed. Something is repaired. Something is prepared for tomorrow. And the child, even now, is still part of it. There is no complete separation between the day's work and the evening's rest. They blend gently into one another. The child may sit for a moment. Not to play. Not to wander. But simply to be still. And even this stillness feels shaped by habit. By expectation. By the quiet rhythm of everything that came before. As the night deepens, the light in the room grows dimmer. Candles or lamps are lit, casting soft shadows across walls and floors. The room becomes smaller in feeling, as if the darkness gently pulls the edges inward. The child prepares for sleep. Clothing is changed. The body slows. The mind, too, begins to soften, not with thoughts of excitement or imagination, but with simple tiredness. The kind that settles quietly. Without resistance. There is no long reflection on the day. No sense of pause to consider what has passed. Only the gradual letting go. And soon, the child lies down. The room is quiet now. Not empty. Just quiet. Breathing slows. The body rests. And the day, so full of structure and expectation, finally fades into stillness. Not ending sharply, but gently. Like light disappearing behind a long evening sky. The night does not bring a different world. It only quiets the same one. Inside small Victorian homes, darkness gathers gently in corners, settling along wooden beams and worn walls. The air is still, softened by the faint scent of ash from the dying fire and the lingering warmth of bodies that have moved through the day. Most children are asleep by now. But sleep in this time is not a long escape. It is a pause between duties. A brief resting place before another early beginning. And even in sleep, the body seems to remember the shape of the day. The rhythm of waking early. Of moving quickly. Of doing what is needed without delay. Morning always comes too soon. For many children in the Victorian world, especially those in poorer families, school is not the only path. In fact, for some, it is only a brief stop in a much longer journey toward work. Work does not wait for adulthood. It begins earlier. Sometimes much earlier. There are places in the city where children enter long before they fully understand what it means to be responsible for a job. Small workshops. Narrow factories. Quiet back rooms filled with tools and materials that require careful handling. The air inside these places feels different. Heavier. Thicker. Often warmed by machines or crowded bodies. The sound of work is steady. Not loud in a chaotic way, but constant. A repeating rhythm of motion. Fabric being cut. Metal being shaped. Threads being pulled and tied. Small objects moving from one hand to another without pause. A child steps into this space with little ceremony. There is no grand introduction. Only instruction. Simple words. Clear expectations. Watch carefully. Repeat exactly. Do not waste time. Do not make mistakes. The child stands at a station that is just their size, or adjusted slightly so they can reach. Their hands begin to learn quickly. Not through explanation, but through repetition. The first hours feel strange. Everything is new. Every movement requires thought. But slowly, the body begins to adapt. The hands learn before the mind does. And soon, tasks that once felt unfamiliar begin to feel almost natural. There is a quiet transformation that happens here. Not dramatic. Not visible. But steady. A child begins to shift into something else. Something shaped by repetition and responsibility. There is little conversation during work. Speech is unnecessary, sometimes even discouraged. The focus is on the task, on accuracy, on pace. Time is measured not in hours, but in output, in what is completed, in what remains unfinished. Breaks are short, shorter than the mind expects. A moment to rest the hands, to stretch slightly, to drink water, then back to work. Always back. Outside, the world continues its own rhythm. People move through streets. Markets open and close. The light changes slowly as the day progresses. But inside, the space feels separate, almost sealed from time. A child working here begins to understand a different kind of day. One that does not expand or wander, but narrows, focuses, repeats. And in this repetition, something else quietly fades. The sense of open time, of unstructured hours, of doing something simply because it feels light or free. Those moments become rare, and eventually, unfamiliar. There are children who move between school and work in the same day. Morning lessons, afternoon labor, evening tasks at home. Each part of the day connected by responsibility. Very little space in between. And slowly, without anyone announcing it, childhood begins to change shape. It does not disappear, but it tightens. Becomes more defined by what is required than what is imagined. Even in homes where work is not factory bound, there are expectations that fill the hours. Sewing, cleaning, helping, watching younger siblings, fetching water, preparing materials for the next day. Each task small on its own, but together they form a steady current that carries the child from morning to night without pause. And in this current, there is little room for wandering thought. Little room for play that has no purpose. Even when children gather together, their time is often structured by necessity. A shared task completed side by side. A brief conversation while working. A moment of stillness before the next responsibility begins. Play, in the open and unplanned sense, becomes something distant. Not forbidden, but absent. Like a path no longer walked. Not because it is blocked, but because no one has time to reach it. As the day moves forward, the child becomes familiar with this rhythm. Work. Pause. Work again. The body adjusts. The mind follows. And slowly, the idea of rest changes too. Rest is no longer something open-ended. It is something contained. A short quiet space before returning to duty. Evening arrives in the same gentle way it always does. Light softens. Sounds fade. The weight of the day settles into tiredness that feels familiar rather than new. And yet, even as the body slows, there is still structure. Still expectation. Still something to be prepared for tomorrow. Clothing laid out. Tools placed carefully. Tasks remembered. Nothing is truly left behind. Everything continues. Just in quieter form. And so, the child returns again to sleep. Not as escape, but as part of the cycle. A necessary pause in a life that moves steadily forward without long breaks or wide open spaces. And in this rhythm, something becomes clear in a quiet way. Childhood here is not a long field of wandering days. It is a narrow path. Steady. Structured. Filled with small responsibilities that grow larger over time. And slowly, almost without notice, the space for play grows smaller still. Not taken away, but replaced. by work, by expectation, by the quiet seriousness of daily life. The night in a Victorian home does not feel empty. It feels occupied, even when everyone is still. There is a sense that the day has only folded itself inward, rather than ending. Shadows rest along the walls. The faint smell of soot lingers in the air. A low warmth remains near the fireplace, slowly fading but never fully gone. Most children are asleep by now. But even in sleep, the house carries its structure, its rules, its quiet expectations. Victorian homes, especially in working families, are not places of wide comfort or open space. They are practical. Every object has a purpose. Every corner is used. There is little that exists only for beauty or ease. Beds are close together. Rooms are shared. Privacy is rare, almost unknown. And because of this, life itself becomes shared in a very constant way. Children grow up surrounded by others at all times. They learn early that silence is often expected, and movement is often directed. There is little room to exist without being aware of others. A parent's voice carries weight, even when it is soft. A glance can be instruction. A pause can be expectation. And so the child learns not just tasks, but awareness. Awareness of tone. Awareness of timing. Awareness of when to speak and when to remain still. This awareness becomes part of daily life. Not taught directly, but absorbed slowly. Like the rhythm of footsteps in a narrow hallway. In the morning, the home wakes in layers. Not all at once, but in stages. One person rises, then another. One task begins, then another follows. There is always movement, but it is never chaotic. It is structured in a quiet, almost invisible way. Even before the child is fully awake, the shape of the day is already forming. Breakfast is simple. Often the same each day. Bread. Porridge. Something warm if available. There is no lingering at the table. Meals are part of the schedule, not a pause from it. The child eats, then prepares to leave the space of home, even if only for a few hours of school. Or for work. Or for both. And behind them, the home continues its steady rhythm. Cleaning. Repairing. Preparing. There is always something to maintain. Always something to arrange for the next part of the day. In wealthier homes, the structure is softer in appearance, but not in principle. There are more rooms. More space. More comfort. But also more rules. Children are guided carefully through behavior. How to sit. How to speak. How to present themselves in front of others. Even leisure is shaped. Reading is encouraged, but chosen. Walking outdoors is allowed, but supervised. Play exists, but it is often quiet, orderly, and brief. It does not spill into the day freely. It is placed into small sections of time, carefully arranged. And so even in comfort, childhood remains contained. Structured. Watched. The idea of too much freedom is often treated with caution. Because freedom, in this time, is not always seen as harmless. It is something that must be guided, shaped, controlled. And so children learn early that time is not entirely theirs. It belongs partly to family, partly to school, partly to expectation. And very little remains unassigned. Even rest is not fully free. Sleep is necessary, of course. But it is scheduled. It arrives at a set hour. In a set place. within a set rhythm. There is comfort in this predictability, but also limitation. Because even rest becomes part of structure. As days pass, this rhythm becomes familiar. So familiar that it no longer feels unusual. The child does not question it. It simply becomes the way life is. Morning leads to task. Task leads to responsibility. Responsibility leads to evening. And evening leads back to morning. Within this cycle, play becomes something that exists at the edges. Sometimes in small moments between duties. Sometimes in brief interactions with other children. A short chase down a street. A quick game using simple objects. A laugh that lasts only a moment before returning to seriousness. But these moments are fragile. They do not anchor the day. They pass quickly. And are often replaced by something more necessary, more expected, more useful. And so over time, play does not disappear in a single moment. It fades. Slowly. Quietly. Like light leaving a room before anyone notices it is dim. There is no single point where childhood becomes entirely serious. No clear boundary where it changes shape. It happens gradually. In small adjustments. In repeated expectations. In the steady filling of hours with responsibility. And as the child grows within this world, they begin to understand time differently. Not as space to explore, but as space to manage, to use, to fill. And this understanding becomes part of them. Not heavy, not painful, just present. Like the steady sound of life continuing outside a window. There are moments in Victorian childhood that do not fully belong to the schedule. They are not planned. They are not written down. They are not asked for. But they appear anyway, quietly, in the small spaces between duties. They do not last long. And they are never treated as important. But for a child, they exist. And sometimes, they feel like breathing. These moments often come when nothing is being demanded. A task is finished a little early. A teacher steps away for a short time. A parent pauses between work. A room becomes still for just a few minutes longer than expected. In those small openings, something gentle can happen. A child may pick up an object without purpose. A piece of string. A small stone. A scrap of paper. Not to use it for anything practical. But simply to hold it. To turn it in their hands. To imagine, briefly, that it could be something else. This is how play survives here. Not as a structured activity. But as a quiet shift in thought. A soft turning of attention away from necessity. It does not announce itself. It does not ask permission. It simply appears, and then begins to fade again. In streets, children sometimes gather in small groups. Not always to play, but sometimes it happens anyway. Between errands. Between errands and home. Between work and return. A narrow alley might become a space for a few seconds of movement. A brief run. A shared smile. A game that has no clear beginning or end. There are no rules written down. No fixed time. No lasting record. Only the moment itself. And then, as quickly as it appears, it ends. Someone is called. Someone remembers a duty. Someone turns away. And the space returns to its ordinary shape. Still, these moments matter in a quiet way. They do not change the structure of the day. But they soften it slightly. Like small cracks of light entering through a closed door. Inside the home, imagination often becomes the only open space left. A child lying quietly may begin to form stories in their mind. Not spoken. Not written. Just thought. A piece of remembered sound becomes something else. A shadow on the wall becomes a shape. A memory becomes a place. There is no instruction for this. No approval needed. It simply happens when the mind is not fully occupied. And even this kind of imagination must remain quiet. Because attention is still expected. Still valued. Still necessary. But the mind finds its own small paths. Even within structure. Even within repetition. In wealthier homes, play sometimes appears in more visible forms. Toys exist, though they are often simple. Wooden figures. Small dolls. Handmade objects meant to teach or entertain in controlled ways. But even these are often used carefully. Not with wild abandon. But with order. With guidance. With purpose. Children are sometimes taught through play, but the play itself is still shaped. Still directed. Still contained within expectation. There is very little that is allowed to become entirely free. And yet, even in these structured forms, something remains alive. A child arranging small objects may still drift into imagination. A child speaking softly to a doll may still create a world that is not written anywhere. A child drawing lines in dust may still feel, for a brief moment, a sense of movement that belongs only to them. These moments are small. But they are real. And they exist in almost every childhood, no matter how structured the world around it may be. As days continue, the rhythm of Victorian life remains steady. Morning. Work. School. Evening. Rest. And within this rhythm, children learn to move without resistance. To follow time rather than shape it. To respond rather than wander. But beneath all of this, something quieter continues. A sense of imagination that never fully disappears. It becomes hidden. Less visible. Less expressed. But still present. Like a small flame protected from wind. Not always seen. But never fully gone. And perhaps this is why, even in a world that leaves so little room for play, children still find it. Not in large spaces. Not in long hours. But in fragments. In pauses. In moments that slip between structure. Because even the most ordered days cannot completely remove the quiet need for something unassigned. Something light. Something unmeasured. And so, play survives. Not loudly. Not freely. But gently. In the background of a life that is otherwise carefully arranged. By the time a child grows a little older in the Victorian world, something subtle begins to change in how days are felt. Not the structure of the day itself. That remains the same. Morning still arrives early. Work still waits. School still demands attention. Evening still brings its quiet return. But the feeling of it begins to shift. There is less surprise in the rhythm now. Less resistance. Less questioning. The day is no longer something that unfolds. It is something that is entered, almost automatically, like stepping into a familiar path without needing to look at the ground. The child begins to move through time with more certainty, but also with less openness. There is a kind of emotional quiet that grows in this stage of life. Not sadness. Not joy. Something more neutral. A steady acceptance of how things are arranged. Tasks are no longer new. They are known. The hands learn them fully. the body remembers them without instruction. Even mistakes become familiar, and are corrected in familiar ways. Everything becomes part of a pattern that no longer feels surprising. At home, the child is often given more responsibility as they grow. Not dramatically, but gradually. A task that once belonged to an adult is now shared, then partially given over, then fully expected. And with each step, there is a quiet increase in awareness of duty. Not spoken loudly, but felt in the way time is used. There is less room for waiting, less room for delay, less room for simply doing nothing. Because even nothing begins to feel like something that must be justified. In school, lessons become more advanced, but not less structured. The expectations rise slowly. More is asked. More is remembered. More is repeated. And the sense of being watched does not lessen with age. It becomes more internal. The child begins to anticipate correction before it comes. Begins to adjust before being told. This is how discipline settles into life. Not as force, but as habit. Outside the home and school, the world of the city continues its steady motion. Markets open in the morning and close in the evening. Factories begin before sunrise and end after darkness. Streets are filled with movement that never quite stops, but also never rushes beyond its own order. Everything has a place within time. Everything follows its own rhythm. And children grow inside this rhythm without fully noticing how deeply it shapes them. As years pass, memory itself begins to change. Early childhood becomes less vivid. Not erased, but softened. The moments that once felt large begin to feel smaller in recollection. The earliest sense of play becomes harder to separate from simple rest, from brief pauses, from small unnoticed actions. Because in a life where structure is constant, memory also begins to take that shape. Structured, steady, selective. There are moments, of course, that remain. A certain light in a room. A sound from a street. A feeling of cold air in the morning. But they do not form a clear picture of long, unbroken play. Instead, they appear as fragments, scattered gently across time. In some homes, children begin to take on roles that resemble adulthood more closely. Not fully adult, but closer. They are trusted with more tasks, more responsibility, more awareness of what must be done without being told. And in this gradual shift, childhood itself begins to feel less like a separate space, and more like a preparation that is slowly fading into the thing it prepares for. Adulthood does not arrive suddenly in this world. It approaches quietly, through repetition, through expectation, through the steady filling of time with responsibility. And so the child does not feel a moment of becoming, only a gradual continuation. Even rest begins to feel different in this stage. Sleep is still necessary, still welcome, but it is no longer a space of complete separation from the day. It is more like a pause between responsibilities. A short closing of awareness before it opens again. The mind, even in rest, carries traces of the day. Not in heavy thoughts, but in quiet patterns, familiar rhythms. And so the boundary between childhood and what comes after becomes less clear. It does not break. It blends. Slowly. Quietly. And in this blending, something else fades gently into the background. The sense of unstructured time. Of doing something without purpose. Of play that exists for no reason other than itself. It does not vanish completely. but it becomes harder to reach, harder to recognize, and eventually, harder to remember as something that once felt natural. Yet even then, it does not fully disappear. Because somewhere within the mind, even in the most structured life, there remains a trace of it. A quiet memory of lightness, of wandering, of time that did not need to be filled. It is not always visible, but it remains. Like something resting beneath layers of carefully arranged days. There comes a point in a Victorian child's life when nothing clearly changes, and yet everything begins to feel slightly different. The days remain the same in shape. Morning still arrives early. Work still waits without hesitation. School still follows its steady rhythm of instruction. Evening still softens the world into quieter tones. But inside the person moving through these days, something begins to settle in a deeper way. A sense that this rhythm is no longer temporary. It is not something being passed through. It is something being entered fully. Not suddenly. Not loudly. But gradually, like a door that closes slowly without a sound. The child becomes older, though there is no clear moment when this is announced. There is no ceremony marking the shift from one stage to another. Instead, responsibility increases in small steps that are almost unnoticeable at first. A task becomes slightly larger. An expectation becomes slightly firmer. A space once given for rest becomes slightly shorter. And over time, these small changes gather together, forming something new without ever declaring itself as new. The body grows stronger. The hands become more practiced. The mind becomes more accustomed to repetition and structure. And with this growth comes a quiet acceptance of what life requires. Not resistance. Not rebellion. But understanding. That time is not wide and open. It is directed. It moves forward in steady lines. And the individual moves with it. In homes where work has been part of childhood, adulthood does not feel like a separate arrival. It feels like continuation. The same tasks, now done with greater skill. The same responsibilities, now carried with greater expectation. The same rhythm, now accepted without question. There is comfort in familiarity. But also a kind of narrowing. Because what once had small moments of softness, small pauses, small uncertainties now becomes more defined, more fixed. There is less room for drifting thought. Less room for unassigned time. Life becomes something that is managed carefully. Not explored. In memory, childhood begins to appear differently from how it was experienced. It is no longer a sequence of long days filled with structured activity. It becomes a set of impressions. A few images. A feeling of early mornings. A sound of footsteps on stone. A sense of always moving towards something that was already decided. The moments of play, once small and brief, become harder to separate from ordinary pauses. They do not stand out as distinct events. They blend into the background of daily life. And so, as adulthood takes shape, the memory of play does not disappear entirely. But it becomes softer. Less defined. More distant. Life in adulthood continues with the same steady rhythm that shaped childhood, but now it is lived with full awareness. Work is not something being prepared for anymore. It is something being done. Time is not something passing toward a future stage. It is the present itself. And in this present, there is a kind of stability that can feel both grounding and quiet. Days are structured. Responsibilities are clear. Expectations are known. There is little uncertainty in what is required. But there is also little space for what is not required. And so, the absence of childhood play is not felt as loss in a sudden way. It is felt as distance. A gradual widening between what once was and what now is. Still, within the quiet routines of adult life, traces remain. A memory of simplicity. A moment of unexpected stillness that feels familiar without being fully understood. A brief softness in thought when work pauses for just a moment longer than expected. These are not disruptions. They are echoes. Small reminders of a time when days were not fully shaped by responsibility. When movement was not always directed. When time, even briefly, felt open. But even these echoes fade quickly, absorbed back into the steady flow of daily life. And so the cycle continues. One day leading into another. One responsibility following the next. One structured moment blending into the next without clear separation. And the early shape of childhood becomes something carried quietly within, not as a burden, and not as a longing, but as a faint background presence like distant light seen through fog, remembered more in feeling than in detail. As the long rhythm of life continues, there comes a quiet understanding that nothing in it was ever meant to pause for long. Not childhood. Not adulthood. Not even rest. Everything moves in a steady flow, shaped by necessity and habit, by work and expectation, by the simple requirement of getting through each day as it arrives. And when one looks back, even without intention, childhood does not appear as something separate and bright. It appears as part of the same flow. Just earlier in the current. Softer in memory. More distant in feeling. The idea of play, in this reflection, is not something sharply lost. It is something that was never fully given space to expand. It existed in small moments. In brief pauses. In fragments of imagination that never needed permission. And because of this, it did not vanish. It simply never became large enough to be remembered as a central part of the day. Instead, it remains scattered. Like small quiet marks across a long path. The Victorian world, with all its structure and expectation, does not speak of this absence directly. It does not name it. It does not frame it as loss. It simply lives its rhythm. And within that rhythm, children grow. Quietly. Steadily. Into the shape that the world has already prepared for them. There is a softness, though, in how life settles at the end of each day. No matter how structured the hours have been, night always arrives with the same gentle stillness. Work ends. Movement slows. The body rests. And in that rest, even if only for a short while, the weight of expectation loosens slightly. The mind drifts. Not toward planning. Not toward duty. But into quiet space. And perhaps it is here, in this brief softness of night, that something of childhood remains most clearly. Not as activity. Not as structure. But as feeling. A faint memory of unfilled time. Of small, unmeasured moments. Of life that once moved without full awareness of its own direction. And then even this fades. Not into disappearance. But into rest. The kind of rest that does not separate life into parts, but gently carries it forward without interruption. And so the story does not end sharply. It simply becomes quiet. Like a room slowly darkening. Like footsteps moving away into distance. Like a day that has fully lived itself and no longer needs to be spoken aloud. Only remembered. Softly. And without urgency. The city does not truly sleep in the Victorian world. It only becomes quieter. The movement does not stop, but it softens, like breath slowing after a long day. Lamps glow faintly along the streets, their light weak but steady, casting long shapes across stone and brick. Windows are dim now. Curtains drawn. Rooms inside filled with still bodies resting after hours of repetition and responsibility. And outside, the streets remain. Empty in places. Occupied in others. But always present. There is something about these quiet streets at night that feels like memory itself. Not loud. Not clear. But layered. As if every footstep that has ever passed through them still lingers, not as sound, but as impression. During the day, these streets carry purpose. Children walking to school. Workers moving toward factories. Voices calling. Wheels turning. Steps quick and certain. But at night, all of that dissolves into stillness. And what remains feels different. Slower. Heavier. More reflective. A child who once walked these paths during the day would recognize them now, but not in the same way. The edges of things feel softer. The world feels less immediate. Even familiar corners seem distant, as if they belong to memory rather than present time. In this quiet, it is easier to imagine what the day once held. Not through clear images, but through feeling. The early cold air of morning. The weight of a small task carried too early in the day. The structured silence of a schoolroom. The steady repetition of work that asked for attention more than thought. These things do not return as scenes. They return as atmosphere. And atmosphere is what lingers most deeply in a life shaped by repetition. Inside homes, the night is steady. A low fire may still glow faintly in the hearth, but it is no longer active. It rests. Like everything else. The people inside are quiet. Not because silence is demanded now, but because silence has become natural after a day that required focus in many different forms. A chair shifts slightly. A floorboard creaks. A breath is taken and released slowly. These are the only movements that remain. Children, if awake for a brief moment, lie still in their beds, listening to the soft quiet around them. There is no urgency in this moment. No instruction. No task waiting immediately ahead. Only rest. But even rest in this world carries traces of structure. The body is used to rhythm. To timing. To cycles that repeat. And so sleep arrives not as escape, but as continuation. A softer form of the same pattern. In these quiet hours, imagination sometimes returns gently. Not as play, but as drifting thought. A half-formed memory of something simple. A shape that once felt interesting for no reason. A sound remembered without context. These fragments float through the mind briefly, then settle again into silence. And the night carries them without resistance. Outside, the city remains still. A few distant movements may occur. A door closing somewhere far away. A soft step on stone. A faint sound of wind moving between narrow streets. But these do not disturb the larger quiet. They are part of it. As if the city itself is breathing slowly, evenly, without interruption. And in this stillness, there is a kind of understanding that does not need to be spoken. That life, as it is lived here, is built on rhythm rather than pause. On structure rather than openness. On continuation rather than interruption. Even childhood, which elsewhere might be remembered as a time of wide, uncontained play, here becomes something more contained within that rhythm. Not absent. Not erased. But folded into the same steady flow as everything else. Morning to evening. Task to task. Day to day. And yet, even in this structure, there is softness. Because repetition, though narrow, creates familiarity. And familiarity creates a kind of quiet comfort. A sense that even if life is shaped tightly, it is also known, understood, expected. And so, the night holds everything gently. Not as ending, but as pause. A pause that will eventually give way to morning again, with the same quiet certainty as always. And somewhere within that cycle, the faint memory of childhood play still exists. Not as something to return to, but as something that once passed through the same rhythm, briefly, before becoming part of memory's softer edges. Time in the Victorian world moves forward without asking to be noticed. It does not announce its passing. It does not pause to be remembered. It simply continues. And because of this, many parts of life become absorbed into the rhythm itself, rather than standing apart from it. Childhood is one of those parts. It is lived fully in its own moment, yet rarely separated from the structure that surrounds it. And so, when it becomes memory, it does not always return as a clear, bright image. It returns as something softer, less defined, more blended with everything else. History, when it looks back, often focuses on what is visible. Buildings, factories, schools, laws, workplaces. The systems that can be described, measured, and recorded. But childhood, especially the kind that leaves little room for play, does not always appear clearly in those records. It exists more in atmosphere than in documentation. In habits rather than events. In repetition rather than moments. A child waking early. A child carrying a small responsibility. A child sitting in silence while learning. A child moving between tasks without pause. These are not dramatic scenes. They are ordinary. And because they are ordinary, they are easily overlooked. But in truth, they form the structure of entire lives. Day after day. Year after year. Slowly shaping the way a person understands time itself. There is a quiet seriousness in this kind of life that does not need to be spoken. It is carried in posture, in movement, in the way attention is given to tasks, even small ones. Not with excitement, not with resistance, but with steady acceptance. And within that acceptance, childhood becomes less about exploration and more about participation. Participation in a rhythm already in motion. A rhythm that does not stop for individual preference. Even moments of rest follow this pattern. They are not unstructured in the way they might appear from the outside. They are placed between necessary actions. They exist within limits that are understood without being stated. And so even stillness becomes part of the system. Not outside of it, but within it. As years pass, those who once lived this childhood carry it forward into adulthood without always realizing how deeply it has shaped them. Not as a memory they revisit often, but as a way of being. A way of moving through time. A way of accepting structure as natural. The absence of extended, unstructured play does not appear as a gap in their awareness. Because it was never fully defined as something separate in the first place. It existed only in fragments. In brief openings. In quiet in-between moments that did not demand attention. And because of that, it becomes harder, later, to name what was missing. Or even to feel that anything was missing at all. But sometimes, in stillness, something subtle returns. Not a full memory. Not a clear image. But a feeling. Of time that was lighter. Of moments that were not yet filled. of movement that had no destination. It is faint, and it does not last long, but it exists, like something resting just beneath the surface of thought. And perhaps this is how childhood remains in the end. Not as a clearly defined chapter, but as a quiet undercurrent, still present, even when it is no longer seen directly. As this long reflection begins to settle, there is no final moment of conclusion. No sharp ending. No clear boundary where the past fully separates from the present. Instead, there is only soft fading. Like evening light slowly leaving a room without anyone noticing exactly when it changed. The Victorian childhood, with all its structure and its steady rhythm, does not end in a single way. It simply dissolves into the life that follows it. Carried forward in habits, in understanding, in the quiet acceptance of time as something that is used, rather than freely shaped. And as the memory of it rests in the mind, it does so without urgency. There is no need to return to it. No need to analyze it. Only to let it remain as it is. A collection of moments. Some heavy. Some ordinary. Some almost forgotten. And within them, the faint presence of what was never fully expanded into play. Not as loss, but as quiet reality. The day ends again, as it always does. Softly. Naturally. Without resistance. And the world, in its steady rhythm, continues forward into another morning that will arrive just as gently as the last. Nothing breaks. Nothing stops. It only flows. And in that flow, everything that was once lived remains gently carried forward, like water moving through a long and quiet river. Not loud. Not sudden. Just continuous. And peaceful in its own way. There is a kind of stillness that follows a long history when it is no longer being actively lived in the mind. Not emptiness. Not silence in the absolute sense. But a softened continuation of thought, like dust settling slowly in a room after movement has ended. The Victorian world remains in that way. Not as something present, but as something remembered. And even that memory is not sharp. It is gentle around the edges. Blurred in places. Held together more by feeling than detail. Childhood, within it, does not stand as a bright separate space. It is woven tightly into the fabric of daily life. So tightly that when one tries to separate it, there is always something that resists being pulled apart. A task that feels like responsibility, even when it is small. A moment of rest that feels brief, even when it is quiet. A rhythm that continues even when nothing is happening. And so the mind, when it returns to this world, does not find a clear boundary between play and work. Between freedom and structure. Between imagination and duty. Everything blends gently into everything else. And this blending is part of what defines it. Not confusion, but continuity. A life lived in steady sequence, where each moment follows the next without dramatic interruption. Morning does not break from night. It grows from it. Evening does not end the day sharply. It softens it. And within that soft transition, childhood exists as one part of a larger flow. Not isolated. Not separated. But carried forward. There is something almost calming in this structure, when viewed from a distance. Not because it is simple, but because it is consistent. Predictable. Steady in its demands. A life that does not shift suddenly, but moves in gradual, familiar steps. And yet, within that familiarity, there is also a quiet narrowing. A sense that time is always already spoken for. Already arranged. already filled before it is experienced. In such a world, the idea of unstructured play becomes difficult to hold in a large, central way. It can only exist at the edges. In pauses. In small gestures. In brief moments that do not interrupt the flow of responsibility, but briefly float above it before returning again. And perhaps that is why it feels, in memory, both present and distant at the same time. Not fully absent, but never fully centered. As the reflection slowly quiets further, even these thoughts begin to soften. There is no need to push toward conclusion. No need to define final meaning. Because this history does not end with clarity. It ends with atmosphere. With the sense of a world that continued its rhythm regardless of how it was observed. And in that continued rhythm, countless small lives moved through days shaped by structure, by expectation, and by steady repetition. Some moments were heavy. Some were ordinary. Some passed without being noticed at all. And together, they formed something continuous. A long, unbroken flow of lived time. Now, as this telling fades, what remains is only that sense of flow. Not a lesson. Not a statement. But a quiet awareness of how life once moved. Slow. Steady. Uninterrupted. And then, like evening settling fully into night, even that awareness begins to rest. Softly. Naturally. Without effort. And the story becomes still. There is a point, after a long reflection like this, where even thought begins to grow quieter. Not because there is nothing left to say, but because everything has already started to soften into the same stillness that surrounded it from the beginning. The Victorian world, once full of movement and structure, now exists only as a lingering atmosphere in the mind. A place made of impressions more than images. Of rhythm more than detail. Of feeling more than story. And in that atmosphere, childhood remains present in a very quiet way. Not as something separate. Not as something sharply defined. But as part of the same continuous fabric that shaped every hour of life. Morning did not arrive with freedom. It arrived with expectation. Evening did not bring release. It brought transition. And between these two steady points, life moved forward with a calm, unwavering consistency. In such a world, the idea of play does not disappear so much as it dissolves into the background of daily existence. It is not removed. It is simply not expanded. Not given space to grow large or central. Instead, it exists in small traces that never interrupt the flow of responsibility. A fleeting thought. A brief pause. A quiet moment where imagination touches the surface of awareness before returning again to the rhythm of what must be done. And over time, even these traces become less distinct. Not gone, but softened. Like footprints slowly fading in soft ground after the wind has passed over them. What remains, then, is not absence, but continuity. A life that does not separate sharply between stages, but flows gently from one form into another. Childhood into responsibility. Responsibility into adulthood. Adulthood into the steady repetition of days that resemble one another more than they differ. And within that repetition, meaning is not always found in single moments. It is found in the pattern itself. In the quiet acceptance of structure. In the steady rhythm of existence. Now, as this reflection draws even closer to silence, there is no need for final words that feel heavy or absolute. No need for closure that forces an ending. Because this kind of history does not conclude in the way stories often do. It fades. Gradually. Like light leaving a room without ever fully announcing its departure. and what remains is a calm sense of having observed something that was never meant to stand out loudly, only to exist steadily, quietly, ordinarily. And now, even that sense begins to rest. Gently. Completely. Without resistance. And the story becomes still. At this point, there is very little left that needs to be said. Not because the story is incomplete, but because it has already moved past the need for explanation. What remains is only the quiet afterimage of a world that once moved with steady purpose. The Victorian childhood, as it has been followed through these slow hours of reflection, does not feel distant in a dramatic way. It feels close enough to understand, but soft enough to no longer press against the present. It is there, but it is not demanding attention. It is like a faint sound that continues even after the source has already become still. A rhythm remembered more than heard. And within that rhythm, childhood appears not as a separate space of carefree time, but as a quiet continuation of everything around it. Work. Learning. Responsibility. Routine. All moving together in a single, unbroken flow. There is something almost calm in how complete that structure is. Not because it is light, but because it is consistent. Nothing in it asks to be outside the system. Everything belongs to it. Even rest. Even silence. Even the smallest pause in the day. And so, when imagining such a life, it becomes clear that what is missing is not always felt in the moment. It becomes visible only when viewed from far away. Only when compared to a different kind of time. A time where hours are not already assigned. Where movement is not always directed. Where play is not something hidden in cracks, but something allowed to stretch openly across the day. But in this world, that is not how time unfolds. Time here is shaped like a path already laid down. And the person walking it learns to follow rather than step outside of it. Still, even within that structure, life continues. Quietly. Ordinarily. Day after day. And in that continuation, there is its own kind of stability. Not freedom in the wide sense, but familiarity. A steady understanding of how each moment will likely unfold. And for many, that familiarity becomes the background of all experience. Now, as this long reflection finally begins to settle completely, there is no direction left to follow. Only a gentle sense of having moved through something slow and continuous. Something that did not rush. Something that did not break. Something that simply remained. And now even that remaining begins to soften. The edges of thought become quieter. The sense of time loosens. And everything slowly returns to stillness, as if it had always been heading there from the very beginning. No final statement is needed. No conclusion is required. Only the quiet continuation of silence. And then, even that fades. Softly. Completely. Like a day that has finished without ever needing to announce its end. There is a moment after a long imagining like this where everything begins to feel slightly farther away. Not in distance, but in weight. The ideas are still present, but they no longer press forward with detail. They rest instead, like objects left quietly in a room after the lights have dimmed. The Victorian childhood that has been followed through these slow, steady layers no longer feels like a sequence of events. It feels more like an atmosphere that once surrounded everything. A way of life where each part of the day naturally led into the next, without sharp edges or sudden changes. Morning into duty. Duty into learning. Learning into more duty. And finally, into rest that was not separate, but simply another phase of the same rhythm. In that rhythm, play was never absent in a loud or dramatic way. It was simply not expanded. Not given long hours. Not given wide space. Instead, it lived in small fragments that never interrupted the structure around them. A moment of imagination that lasted only briefly. A small movement without purpose that disappeared as quickly as it appeared. And because life was so full of steady expectation, these fragments did not stand apart. They blended back into the flow of everything else. Now, as the reflection becomes quieter, even those fragments feel softer. Less defined. More like impressions than memories. And yet they remain. Because anything lived deeply, even in small ways, does not fully vanish. It settles. It becomes part of the texture of thought. Part of how time is understood. There is a calmness in this kind of fading. Not an ending that closes sharply, but a gentle loosening. As if the mind itself is slowly setting down what it has been holding. One idea at a time. One rhythm at a time. Until nothing feels urgent anymore. Only present in a softened form. The Victorian world, in this final sense, is no longer something being observed closely. It is something that has already receded into a quiet background. Still there. Still understandable. But no longer demanding attention. And in that distance, it becomes easier to feel what it truly was at its core. A life built on repetition. On structure. On steady continuation. Where even childhood moved within boundaries that were rarely questioned because they were simply part of how everything functioned. And now, as even that understanding begins to rest, there is nothing left to analyze. Nothing left to follow step by step. Only the sense that the entire reflection has slowly reached its natural quiet point. Not through conclusion, but through settling. Like dust finally resting after a long, slow drip through still air. And so the story does not end. It simply becomes quiet. And remains that way. Without effort. Without urgency. Without need for continuation, there is not much more that remains to be added now. Only the softest layer of thought, like the last light of evening resting briefly before it disappears completely. The Victorian childhood, once followed step by step through its structured rhythm, no longer feels like something unfolding in time. It feels settled. Held gently in place by memory rather than motion. And in that stillness, everything that once seemed separate begins to merge again into a single, quiet impression. The early mornings that arrived before comfort. The days filled with instruction, repetition, and responsibility. The brief, fragile pauses where imagination slipped through unnoticed gaps in time. And the evenings that closed each day without ever fully releasing it. All of it now rests together in one continuous feeling. Not broken into parts anymore. Not measured. Just present in a softened way. There is a certain calmness in how fully structured that world was. Even if that structure left little room for unplanned moments, it also gave each day a clear shape. A predictable movement from beginning to end. A rhythm that carried itself forward without needing interruption. And within that rhythm, children learned to move as part of something already established. Not stepping outside of it, but flowing with it. Now, as the reflection reaches its final quiet state, even that sense of movement begins to slow. What is left is not detail. Not sequence. Only atmosphere. A gentle awareness that life once moved in a steady, continuous line, where even childhood existed within boundaries that were simply accepted as part of how time worked. And in that acceptance, there was no need for constant questioning. No need for expansion. Only continuation. And so, As everything begins to soften completely, there is nothing left to hold onto in a structured way. No final explanation. No final image. Only the fading sense of having been present within a world that moved slowly, steadily, and without interruption. And now even that presence begins to dissolve. Not suddenly, but gently. Like sound fading into distance. Like light settling fully into night. Like a long day finally becoming still. And then there is nothing more to follow. Only quiet. Soft. Complete. And resting. At this point, the story no longer moves forward in any real sense. It only lingers. Like a memory that has already finished forming, but has not yet fully left the mind. The Victorian world that has been followed through these slow, quiet layers is no longer active in thought. It is settled now. Not gone. Just still. In that stillness, everything becomes softer than before. The structured mornings. The steady repetition of work and learning. The quiet obedience to time as something already arranged. Even the small, hidden fragments of play that once appeared in brief moments of freedom now feel distant, as if they belong to a different layer of time. Not erased. Just far away enough that they no longer press against the present. And perhaps that is how most of this world exists in memory. Not as sharp detail, but as atmosphere. A general feeling of order. Of rhythm. Of life moving forward in a way that rarely paused to question its own shape. There is something deeply continuous about it. Not fragmented. Not unpredictable. But flowing in a steady line that carried childhood forward into adulthood without ever breaking its own pattern. And now, even that idea begins to lose its structure. What remains is only the sense that everything once followed a rhythm that did not need explanation while it was being lived. It simply was. And in that was, there is a quiet completeness. Not emotional. Not dramatic. Just settled. Like a room after everything has already been put away. As this final layer of reflection continues to soften, there is nothing more that needs to be followed. No detail left waiting. No moment still unfolding. Only the gentle awareness that the entire journey has already completed itself, long before it reached this point. And now even that awareness begins to fade. Not abruptly, but in the same slow, natural way that has accompanied everything else in this telling. Like evening deepening into night without resistance. Like thought relaxing into silence without effort. Like a world that has finally finished being remembered. And so there is nothing left to hold. Nothing left to trace. Only quiet. Simple. Uninterrupted. And complete. There is a point where even continuation becomes part of silence. Not because there is more to add in the world being described, but because the act of describing itself begins to slow down, like footsteps fading on a long empty street. The Victorian childhood, carried through these many slow layers, has already settled into its final form in the mind. It does not expand anymore. It does not unfold. It simply remains in a quiet state of understanding. A structured world. A steady rhythm of days. A life where time moved forward without asking to be shaped differently. And within that movement, children grew not in wide open space, but within carefully defined boundaries that guided each part of their day. Morning into responsibility. Responsibility into learning. Learning into more responsibility. And finally into rest that was never truly separate, only another part of the same cycle. Now, as even that cycle is no longer being actively followed, what remains is something softer than memory. More like a feeling of having once observed something complete. Not in detail. but in atmosphere. There is a calmness in that. A sense that nothing is unfinished, because nothing was ever meant to pause sharply in the first place. Everything flowed. Everything continued. And because it continued so steadily, it now rests in thought without tension. Even the idea of play, which once appeared in such small, quiet fragments, no longer feels absent or present. It simply feels distant. Like something that existed at the edges of a life that was already full. Not missing. Not emphasized. Just part of the background of how time was lived. And now, as this final reflection reaches its softest point, there is nothing left that needs to be followed further. No direction remaining. No structure to continue building. Only the gentle sense that everything has already completed its quiet passage through the mind. And so even this awareness begins to dissolve. Not suddenly, but in the same slow, natural way that has shaped everything before it. Like a room growing darker without anyone noticing the exact moment it changed. Like sound fading into distance without ever fully stopping. Like thought settling into rest without effort or resistance. And then there is only quiet. Not empty. Not heavy. Just quiet. And in that quiet, nothing more is needed. There is a gentle limit to how far a reflection like this can go before it begins to turn inward. Not ending. Not continuing. But softening into something that no longer depends on language to feel complete. The Victorian world, once traced through its slow mornings and structured days, is already fully formed in the mind now. It does not change anymore. It does not develop further. It simply rests as a finished impression. A world built on repetition, where each part of life moved in quiet connection with the next. Where childhood was not a separate landscape of endless play, but a stage within a larger, carefully ordered rhythm. And now, even that understanding feels like it has settled into place. Not sharp. Not active. Just present in a very quiet way. When a life is shaped so consistently by structure, it leaves behind a certain kind of memory. Not one filled with isolated moments, but one filled with continuity. A sense that time itself was always moving forward in a steady line, without sudden breaks or open pauses. And so when that life is reflected upon, it does not return as a series of events. It returns as atmosphere. A soft, continuous feeling of order and rhythm. Of days that followed one another in familiar patterns. Of responsibilities that filled time so completely that little space remained unassigned. Now, as this reflection reaches its most quiet point, even that atmosphere begins to fade slightly at the edges. Not disappearing. Just loosening. Like fog slowly lifting without revealing anything new beneath it. Because there is nothing new left to reveal. Only the same steady understanding, already seen from every angle that matters in this slow, gentle telling. And so the words no longer try to move forward. They simply rest where they are. Allowing the silence beneath them to become more noticeable. More present. More complete. And in that presence, there is a kind of closure that does not need to be stated. It is not a conclusion. It is a settling. Like a long breath finally released. Like a day that has fully finished its shape. Like a story that no longer needs to continue in order to remain understood. And now even this final thought begins to soften into quiet. Not ending. Just easing. Until there is nothing more that needs to be spoken. At this point, even the idea of continuation feels like something happening at a distance. Not far away in space, but far away in urgency. As if everything that once felt like it needed to be explained has already been gently understood, and what remains no longer asks for structure or direction. The Victorian childhood, as it has been slowly walked through in these layers of calm reflection, is no longer something unfolding. It is something already fully seen in feeling. A life shaped by steady rhythm. By early mornings that arrived without softness. By days filled with learning, work, and expectation. By evenings that closed without breaking the pattern of responsibility. And within all of it, the quiet absence of extended play did not stand as a loud void. It existed more like a background condition. A space that never fully opened, because the structure of life itself filled nearly every corner of time. Now, as even that understanding settles deeper, there is no longer a sense of moving through ideas. Only a sense of resting beside them. Letting them remain where they are. Unchanged. Complete in their own quiet way. There is something almost calming in how consistent that world was. Not because it was simple, but because it was continuous. Nothing appeared without purpose. Nothing lingered without function. Even stillness had its place inside the rhythm of the day. And so, when it is all remembered at once, it does not feel fragmented. It feels whole. Not vivid, but unified. And in that unity, everything becomes softer. Even memory itself begins to lose its need to hold detail tightly. It relaxes. It lets go slightly. Until what remains is only atmosphere again. A gentle sense of time that once moved steadily forward, without pause, without interruption, without expansion into anything beyond its established shape. And now, even this atmosphere begins to quiet further. Not fading away. Just becoming less distinct. Like sound no longer needing to be heard in order to exist. Like light that no longer needs to be bright in order to be present. And so there is nothing left to build, nothing left to extend. Only the awareness that everything has already completed itself in a slow and natural way. And with that awareness, even thought becomes still. Not ending. Just resting. Completely. At this point, there is nothing left that the story is trying to become. No direction pulling it forward. No structure asking it to expand. Only a quiet sense of having already passed through everything that needed to be seen in this slow, steady way. The Victorian childhood, as it has been gently traced through morning and evening, work and learning, repetition and rest, now rests fully in the mind as a single, continuous impression. Not broken into parts anymore. Not measured in stages. Just present as atmosphere. A world where time moved in steady rhythm. Where each day followed the same familiar shape. Where childhood existed inside structure rather than outside it. And where even the smallest moments were folded into the larger flow of responsibility. Now, as this reflection becomes even quieter, the need to describe it begins to disappear as well. Because what remains is already understood without further explanation. It does not need to be shaped again. It does not need to be repeated in new words. It only needs to remain as it is. And so the mind begins to let go of the effort of holding it clearly. Not forgetting. Just releasing. Allowing everything to settle into a softer form of awareness. Like a landscape slowly fading into evening mist, where edges are no longer sharp, but still gently present. There is a kind of peace in this final softening. Not a dramatic peace. Not something that arrives suddenly. But a quiet one. The kind that comes when nothing is left unfinished in thought. When everything has already been gently observed and allowed to pass through understanding. And now even that sense begins to dissolve slightly. Not into absence. But into stillness that no longer needs to be defined. The story does not end because something stops. It ends because nothing is left that needs to continue. And in that absence of need, everything becomes complete in a very quiet way. Like a long day that has fully settled into night without resistance. Like a distant sound that has already finished echoing. Like a memory that no longer needs to be revisited in order to remain understood. And so there is only this remaining softness. This final layer of quiet. Not holding anything. Not reaching anywhere. Just resting. Completely. And without return. There is a point where continuation itself stops feeling like movement. It becomes something softer than that. Almost like breathing that no longer needs to be noticed in order to continue. At this stage, the Victorian world is no longer being followed step by step. It has already been fully seen in its stillness. Its structure. Its rhythm. Its quiet repetition of days that carried childhood forward without allowing it to expand in wide, unstructured ways. And now even that understanding feels settled. Not active. Not changing. Just present. Like a long surface of memory resting evenly in the mind. There is no more unfolding to describe. Only a gentle remaining awareness that everything once moved in a steady pattern. And that within that pattern, childhood existed as something woven into daily life rather than separated from it. Work and learning were not interruptions of childhood. They were its shape. Its rhythm. Its expectation. And even rest followed that same gentle structure, never fully breaking away from the flow of responsibility. Now, as this reflection reaches its deepest quiet, even language begins to feel slightly unnecessary. Not because it has failed, but because it has already completed what it was gently carrying. The atmosphere is already here. The feeling is already present. And it does not require more detail to exist. So the mind no longer reaches forward to build further meaning. It simply stays with what is already understood. Like standing in a quiet room after everything has been arranged into place, and nothing more is left to adjust. There is a calmness in that. Not emotional. Not dramatic. Just still. A stillness that does not ask for continuation. And because of that, even the idea of next becomes softer now. Less like a step forward. More like an echo that is slowly losing its need to be followed. And in that fading echo, there is nothing unfinished. Nothing waiting. Nothing missing. Only the sense that everything has already reached its natural end point, long before words try to mark it. And so this final moment does not close sharply. It does not end. It only becomes quieter. Until even quiet no longer feels separate from what came before it. And then there is nothing more to say. Only stillness. And the gentle absence of anything that needs to continue. There is a kind of stillness that does not feel like ending. It feels more like something slowly lowering itself into place, until it no longer needs to be held at all. At this point, the Victorian childhood that has been carried through these long, slow layers of thought is already complete in understanding. Not as a list of events. Not as a sequence of scenes. But as a continuous atmosphere of structured days, steady routines, and quiet repetition. A world where time did not stretch wide, but moved forward in familiar, narrow paths. And where childhood existed fully inside that movement, shaped by it, carried by it, never separate from it. Now even that image has settled. It does not shift anymore. It does not develop. It simply remains, like something placed gently down after being carried for a long distance. There is no pressure in it now. No urgency. Only recognition. And with that recognition, the mind no longer tries to extend the story further. Because there is nothing left that requires extension. The rhythm has already been understood. The structure has already been seen. The feeling has already been absorbed. And so what remains is only a quiet awareness of completion that does not announce itself. It does not need to. It is already present in the softness of everything that has been said. In the gradual slowing of thought. In the gentle fading of detail into atmosphere. And in that atmosphere, nothing stands out sharply anymore. Everything is part of the same calm surface. Even memory itself begins to rest more lightly. Not disappearing. Just no longer pressing forward. Like a surface of water that has finally become still after a long time of movement. There is no need to reach beyond this point. No need to add anything more. Because what has been understood does not require repetition to remain understood. It only needs to be left as it is. And so the words do not try to continue. They simply become quieter. And quieter still. Until even the idea of continuation feels distant, like something already released. And in that release, there is nothing incomplete. Only stillness. Soft. Simple. And fully at rest. And so, the story does not end in a clear moment. It does not close with a final event, or a final scene, or a final word that marks a sharp line between what was and what is now. It ends in the way many ordinary lives end in memory. Quietly. Without announcement. Without resistance. The Victorian childhood, with all its steady routines and structured days, simply returns to stillness. Not forgotten. Not removed. Just no longer unfolding. It remains as a soft impression of a world where time moved in narrow, steady lines, and where each day carried its own weight of responsibility from morning until night. And in that steady rhythm, play existed only in small, passing fragments never fully expanded, never fully absent, just quietly folded into the edges of daily life. Now even those edges have softened. And what remains is only a calm awareness that life, in that time, moved forward in its own consistent way. One day at a time. One task at a time. One quiet moment after another. And that is all. Nothing more is needed to hold it together. Nothing more is needed to understand it. So it simply rests now. Like a long evening finally settling into night. Like a room growing dim without anyone noticing the exact moment the light changed. And like all things that are fully complete in memory, it becomes quiet. And stays that way.